Holly Harris is the executive director of the U.S. Justice Action Network, joining us this morning to talk about the Attorney General's change of opinion, change of direction on sentencing guidelines in the United States. Back us up just a little bit. As in the Obama administration, what was Eric Holder's approach and the president's approach to sentencing, to federal sentencing guidelines?
So the previous Attorney General, Eric Holder, had issued a directive to his staff not to charge at the highest levels. So in other words, not to invoke a lot of these mandatory minimum sentences that we know have helped explode the prison population and in fact have not given us the public safety return that we deserve. Very recently, the new Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, who has long been an opponent of sentencing reform, reversed that directive and is now directing his staff and U.S. attorneys and prosecutors around the country, federal prosecutors, to charge at the highest levels, including at mandatory minimum sentencing levels. And obviously, my organization feels like that's going in the wrong direction because states around the country that have implemented reforms to mandatory minimum sentencing and harsh sentencing laws for particularly your low-level nonviolent offenders have seen much better public safety outcomes.
It did seem toward the end of the Obama administration, the end of the 115th Congress, too, there was some bipartisan efforts both on the issue of federal sentencing, but more broadly, more broadly on that, but particularly on the area of cocaine and crack cocaine and powder cocaine, the disparity in the sentencing on those crimes.
Sure, and I want to be very careful about making this an Obama initiative. Actually, President Obama waded into this issue sort of in the twilight of his presidency. In fact, the real pioneers of this effort were conservative Republican governors. Governor Perry in Texas, a lot of people call him the godfather of criminal justice reform. In fact, he was able to significantly reduce the prison population in Texas, save the taxpayers roughly $2 billion, and because Texas implemented these reforms, they've now seen their lowest crime rate since 1968. I'd also be remiss not to mention Governor Nathan Deal of Georgia, again, has significantly reduced the prison population, has addressed racial disparities in Georgia's prison system, has done amazing things in reentry, has lowered crime rates, lowered recidivism rates, and saved the taxpayers of Georgia roughly $250 million. So the pioneers of this effort were Republican governors in the states, and it's really unfortunate that the federal side is lagging behind.
Well, we heard in the campaign President Trump, then candidate Trump, talking a lot about law and order, but what's behind the Attorney General Jeff Sessions and his change of direction?
Well, he was an opponent of the Sentencing Reform and Corrections Act, which my organization and many reform organizations around the country supported. I'm not quite sure why we're going in this direction because, again, the data proves that these reforms that we work on make us safer, but it could be politics. But again, I don't really understand that either because the polling that my organization has done in about a dozen states around the country shows that these reforms have a lot of support across the ideological spectrum.
Let's open up our phone lines to hear from our viewers on the issue of federal sentencing guidelines, and then we'll show you what the Attorney General actually had to say, some of what he had to say when the announcement was made. 202-748-8000 is the number to call for Democrats, 202-748-8001. Republicans and Independents, 202-748-8002. Or send us a tweet at C-SPAN WJ. Our guest is Holly Harris, who's actually, you've been involved in Republican politics in Kentucky, but you also have a background in legal issues as well.
Sure, my whole life. In fact, I started my career at the Justice Cabinet in Kentucky and actually wrote the brief defending the lethal injection protocol, and obviously my views have evolved a bit over the last decade. So
we'll get to your calls in a moment. Let's hear from the Attorney General talking about the sentencing guidelines.
Going forward, I have empowered our prosecutors to charge and pursue the most serious offense, as I believe the law requires, most serious, readily provable offense. It means that we're going to meet our responsibility to enforce the law with judgment and fairness. It is simply the right and moral thing to do. But it is important to note that unlike previous charging memoranda, I have given our prosecutors discretion to avoid sentences that would result in an injustice. This is a key part of President Trump's promise to keep America safe.
What did you hear first of all, were you surprised when he made this announcement fairly early here in the administration?
I'm not sure that we were surprised. Again, it's unfortunate, and we're going to continue our efforts to reach out to the president and to the president's top advisors to make them aware of the success that these reforms have had in the states, and that, in fact, it's really Republicans that have spearheaded a lot of these efforts. And, you know, we just heard the Attorney General talking about the right and moral thing to do. Here we are, Memorial Day weekend. At any given time in this country, veterans account for 9 of every 100 individuals who are sitting behind bars.
So nearly 10% of the population.
Yeah, and think about that.
Prison population.
And again, that's because a lot of these individuals come back from their service. They've developed some health issues. They get into drug addiction. They make poor choices. They become entangled in a broken justice system. And this Memorial Day weekend, I hope we're thinking about what's moral and what's right. And we should really be doing more to address the real core problems that our veterans face and offer more treatment and rehabilitation options.
So give us an example of how the sentencing might be different under the new guidelines issued by Attorney General Jeff Sessions.
Well, again, what's going to end up happening is that individuals, and again, at the federal level, we're talking about, you know, mostly nonviolent drug crimes. So what's going to happen is these prosecutors are now forced to charge at the very highest levels, not to use their own discretion. We heard the Attorney General just talking about prosecutors being able to use their discretion, but in fact, the memo states that prosecutors will have to seek the approval of their supervisors or a U.S. attorney in order to deviate from this directive. So in fact, this adds more bureaucracy and more inefficiency to the system. And certainly, you know, we believe there should be more prosecutorial discretion to take into consideration the individual circumstances of every case, because they're different.
Your organization is U.S. Justice Action Network.
Sure.
What do you do?
So we're the largest bipartisan organization working at both the state and federal level to reform our broken justice system. We actually started 2 years ago with 8 core organizations, the NAACP working with FreedomWorks and the Faith and Freedom Coalition working with the ACLU. So groups that rarely agree on anything, that all agree on these criminal justice reforms. We have now grown to 14 states across the country. We're broader than just the 8 groups. We have partners in all of our target states. And we've moved significant legislation in almost all of them. So the states are really moving forward aggressively.
And to parallel that, the news from the Wall Street Journal this week about Louisiana. We talked on New Orleans on a different issue, but here the state, they say, is poised to overhaul. Their overhaul is aimed at reduce their incarceration rate, which they say is the largest in the country in Louisiana. They write that Governor Edwards, the only Democratic governor in the Deep South, and some top Republican lawmakers are backing legislation that would reduce sentences for a range of crimes and expand parole and probation and other alternatives to prison for nonviolent offenders. Passage by the GOP legislature convened through June 8th would be a historic step, projected to reduce the prison population in Louisiana by 10% and save $262 million over the next decade.
Yes, and we're aggressively fighting for those reforms. We're good friends with Governor Edwards, but also with lawmakers like Representative Julie Emerson, who is a conservative Republican, a young up-and-comer rising star, who's also pushing for these reforms. I want to give you just real briefly one of the cases that resulted in a really egregious injustice. It's the case of Bernard Noble. Mr. Noble had a couple of offenses in his youth, but had been crime-free for roughly 10 years. He was pulled over by law enforcement while he was biking. It's still unclear as to actually why he was pulled over. He was found with 1 joint on his person, and he's now, because of persistent felony offender laws, serving 13 years. 13 years behind bars. That's right. Yeah. And he had a catering business. He was taking care of multiple children. And consider now what happens to the clients of his business, his employees, his children. And you know, 13 years, is that really what, you know, is going to make us safer? You know, we would argue absolutely not. And we should have, you know, more discretion in sentencing, not just at the state level, but at the federal level.
Holly Harris is our guest. We're talking federal sentencing guidelines, 202-748-8000 for Democrats, 202-748-8001 Republicans, independents and all others, 202-748-8002. We've also set aside a line if you've had experience with the criminal justice system, state or federal, That line, 202-748-8003. Mario in Las Vegas on our Democrats line. Good morning.
How you doing?
Fine,
Well, I'd just like to comment that Sessions' comments are indicative of what Trump and the administration is doing. I cannot believe that we're going backwards. We're incarcerating largely people of color for nonviolent crimes, taken away from their families, their children, perpetuating a system that labels people. I work with a lot of felons who come out of prison. There's such an anger that brews in them because they served 12 years for selling a couple ounces of weed because we have a system that only allows you to make $8.50 an hour. Once they get out, they might as well keep wearing the inmate garb they're issued with felon written on the back because it's carried with them. And they're stigmatized. They can't get a good job. They can't ever chase the American dream again, and they've lost their family. This is crazy. This whole administration we can't even. The civil rights were filed was 50 years ago, and we still haven't got that right.
We'll get a response. Thanks, Mario.
So I really appreciate Mario's point. And in fact, individuals who've been incarcerated work 9 fewer weeks per year and take home 40% less annual pay than their colleagues. So what happens when they can't successfully find a job, improve their education, find adequate housing? Well, of course, they're going to return to crime, return to prison. And that's the cycle of failure that we seek to break. And, you know, Jeff Sessions talks about these longer sentences making us safer, but in fact, the data proves that these longer sentences do not, particularly for your low-level nonviolent offenders, because what are they going to do while they're behind bars? They're going to be mixed in with violent offenders. So, you know, what's going to happen then? They become better criminals rather than better citizens. And you've got to consider that 95% of the individuals who are currently incarcerated are getting out someday. And we've got to consider what we're returning to society.
It sounds like your own views on the justice system have evolved over the years, taking quite a turn. What was a sort of a key or pivotal moment for you?
Well, first of all, I think when you're very young, the world is very black and white, and there's right and there's wrong. And I think as you get older and you make mistakes of your own, and you've been afforded second chances, as I have many times, I'm sure you have, and pretty much everybody we know in Washington has, you know, your views change and the world becomes shades of gray. And certainly now, after seeing the data from states that have significantly reduced their prison populations, I mean, there's just no question that these states have been more successful in lowering crime rates, lowering recidivism rates, saving hundreds of millions and in some cases billions of dollars. And that's money that can be reinvested in better training for law enforcement. It could be invested in education, infrastructure improvements, economic development, areas where, quite frankly, if we were spending a little bit more money in the first place, perhaps we wouldn't see so many people entering our justice system.
We have set aside a line for those of you who've had experience with the criminal justice system in one way or the other. Chicago, Ron's on that line. Go ahead, Ron. Tell us your story.
Yes, I was incarcerated several times on low-level drug offenses, and out of 2, now I'm eligible for the maximum based on the fact that I have 2 prior convictions, and I come to find out there was a back end that they were getting paid. So it's an incentive so that to incarcerate low-level criminals so that they get the back end and get paid for that incarceration, the mass incarceration of low-level drug dealers. And I think they need to imply a more stricter sentencing for education so that they can try to educate the ones that are doing this thing. For lack of a better word, it's always about the money. It's always about the money for me.
I'm so glad that we had a caller from Illinois, because Illinois, I think, is the perfect example of why we must have reform in this country. You know, contrary to what you may be hearing out there, crime rates have been, you know, dropping all around the country for years. However, we have seen spikes in violent crime. Some of that obviously has taken place in Chicago. Illinois, though, is at 130% capacity in their prisons. It's got one of the most dangerous prison systems in the country. They're just throwing people behind bars, and obviously they're not seeing positive public safety results. So, Illinois right now is in the midst of trying to pass comprehensive criminal justice reform. Their governor, Governor Rauner, has said that he would like to reduce the prison population by 25% over 10 years. That's a tall order. And right now, politics is getting in the way. And I hope that the people of Illinois will hold the politicians' feet to the fire and say, now is the time for reform, because we just cannot sustain this level of crime in our communities any longer.
What's the data say about people, low-level offenders who've been released? The Obama administration, over the course of the last several years of its administration, certainly made a number of pardons. In fact, I don't know if this is accurate, but I think President Obama held the highest number of pardons over the course of his term.
Well, we're focused on breaking down obstacles for those individuals, removing the stigma, ensuring that these individuals can find jobs. The greatest obstacle to returning to a life of crime is a job.
Yeah.
And so, we've got to ensure that these people are employed. And this is a good opportunity for me to plug Ohio. Ohio implemented some really positive reentry programming several years ago, and they were able to take their recidivism rate to 40% to 27%, because again, they broke down barriers for these individuals that enabled them to find jobs, improve their education, find housing, support their families, and ultimately turn away from crime for good.
Let's go to our Republican line. Joe in Annapolis, Maryland.
Yes, hello. Thank you for taking my call. This is a very interesting subject, and one that I don't think has been reported accurately by the press since Jeff Sessions released his memo. The press has indicated this as a huge departure from previous policy. And it is from Eric Holder's policy, but it's been the norm prior to Obama taking the presidency that U.S. attorneys would charge the highest crime that could be reasonably proved. And I'd just like to make 3 points very quickly that I hope your guest will address and not avoid. The first is calling a lot of these defendants and convicts nonviolent. Perhaps, but they were potentially violent because they carried guns, and often the possession of a weapon increased their sentence. Drug dealing is an inherently violent occupation, and those people were subject to laws, minimum sentencing laws, that the people passed through their representatives. So to have President Obama and Eric Holder subvert the statutory requirements of minimum sentencing was not right. It was, in fact, President Obama's failure to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, which is constitutional duty. And I'll say one last thing. Eric Holder directed his U.S. attorneys to be false with the court, to be less than candid by not charging and not even informing the court, the judges, of the amount of drugs that they were caught with, so as to reduce their sentence or not allow a higher sentence to be given. And that caused those attorneys to violate their ethical obligations of the bar that they are a part of, to be candid with the court. And I'm very glad that Jeff Sessions has done this, and it is a return to democratic representation. I'd like to hear your guests' views on that.
Thanks, Joe.
Well, first of all, we're big believers in prosecutorial and judicial discretion, which is, again, why we believe that these prosecutors ought to be able to make their own judgments regarding what is the most appropriate charge for these individuals. And furthermore, we're for more judicial discretion, which is why we believe that one-size-fits-all mandatory minimum sentencing is not appropriate and has, in fact, led to very egregious injustices. And I'd like to say another thing as well, and I don't want this, again, to be made about Obama versus Trump or Eric Holder versus Jeff Sessions. This has been an organic movement that began in the states. And what we do know is that over the course of the last 10 years, the 10 states that have most significantly reduced their prison populations through the reforms that we've been discussing have seen an average drop in their crime rates of 14%. Conversely, the 10 states that have most significantly increased their prison populations through the old tough on crime, mandatory minimum sentencing, persistent felony offender laws have only seen an average of an 8% drop in crime. And shouldn't our ultimate goal in this country be about making our communities safer? That means lowering crime rates, lowering recidivism rates, and we know that safely reducing the prison population can accomplish that.
Our guest, Holly Harris, the line for those of you who had experience with the criminal justice system,
Welcome, and thank you for taking my calls. One thing that Sessions has said nothing about is financing these institutions that we are now going to be housing these new individuals coming in, more drug pushers coming in. This is nothing new. I recall back in 1986, 1987, 1988, it was war on crime, and we started shoving all of those individuals that had anything with pushing drugs into our prison system. The only bad thing about it was all of a sudden one day we looked up. We are paying more money to house an individual on a small crime dealing with drugs that he might have been pushing than to educate our children. My question is, who's going to pay for this?
Taxpayers. We are. And actually right now in this country, we're spending roughly $80 billion a year on incarceration. And those costs have exploded all over the country. And one of the reasons why the states have moved so aggressively on reform is because they're all facing a budget crisis. And quite frankly, these legislators have to face their constituents every single day. And so that's why we believe the states are moving forward. And you know, there's a real disconnect between what's happening in the states and what's happening on the Hill. A lot of these members on the Hill don't understand what's happening in their own backyards. And if they could see our polling that shows that, you know, 70, 80, 90% of voters across the ideological spectrum support reform, I think they would consider voting for this legislation. And in fact, I don't even think it'd be a question.
After the Jeff Sessions announcement was made, some dozen states' attorneys, general federal attorneys in states, wrote letters saying they oppose the effort, including look at the letter by the attorney for the District of Columbia, Carl Racine. What were they saying in their letters objecting to the
Well, again, this should all be
General?
about public safety. Unfortunately, we're making this about politics, and this should be about improving public safety. And in fact, you know, we've worked with several prosecutors, former prosecutors at the federal level, some of them very celebrated, all of them appointed by Republicans, by the way, individuals like Brett Tolman, the former U.S. attorney from Utah, very conservative state, Michael Mukasey, Larry Thompson, you know, all of these individuals. Larry Thompson, by the way, who spoke up for Jeff Sessions during his confirmation hearing. But these individuals all firmly believe in sentencing reform and the reforms that we've been talking about. So again, this isn't about Republican, Democrat. This is about what improves public safety, and that's why we're seeing more and more members of law enforcement, including prosecutors, falling on the side of reform.
Let's hear from William in Presque Isle, Maine. Good morning.
Yeah. I have a question. The criminal reform justice that they're stricter laws should apply to high-income people and people in high office be also held accountable to the same thing as Jeff Sessions lied to Congress, so it's committing perjury. Now, why do they not be accountable for their actions too, not just pick on the hard-working people?
Well, I guess that's a fair question. I would say, you know, what we strive for with our organization is to make the justice system fair for all and accessible to all. And we truly believe that these reforms are going to address a lot of the racial disparities that one of your previous callers addressed. But I'd also like to make the point that, do you know what the fastest growing segment of the prison population is right now? No. Women. And no one's talking about that. And it's because of drugs. I recently visited a treatment center, a jail in Louisville, Kentucky, my home state, and went into this treatment facility. It's all women. And when I asked them how many of the women were mothers, every hand in the room went up. It's heartbreaking. And again, these women, they're drug addicts. You know, we've got to be doing more to address the root cause of a lot of the crime in this country. And that's, we've got to be doing more for treatment, rehabilitative services, job training. Otherwise, we're just going to continue this cycle of failure. We're just going to keep throwing people behind bars, and they're going to become better criminals and not better citizens.
Rex is here in the nation's capital. It says on the screen that you have some experience with the criminal justice system. Go ahead.
Yes, just being born and raised in a middle-class neighborhood, I still got picked up one time with a small bag of marijuana. And the judge was fair and gave me 3 days, and you stay on probation, you stay out of trouble. From my experience when I was inside, that when you do have the hard type of criminal guys if they came from a bad neighborhood. The environment wasn't protected. So it's like, does poverty cause crime or does crime cause poverty? And then when they legislate, like she's eloquently breaking down all the system, and I'm learning a lot from her, that the callers that call in are always talking about the legislation and how the rules are passed, but the same police protection isn't afforded in some of these neighborhoods as other neighborhoods are. Those drugs that are coming in the country are not brought in by the inmates. So our failure to protect our neighborhoods is the reason why some of us, we having a criminal justice problem, and now we're seeing that the criminal justice system is actually a business.
Rex, we'll get a response from Holly Harris. Appreciate your call.
So he's, talking about policing issues that have, become a real point of contention in this country. And we're now at a point where there is such a lack of trust between law enforcement and the communities that they serve. And the criminal justice reforms that I've been talking about this morning aren't going to solve all of our problems in this country, but I think they will forge a bridge of trust, and they can form a bridge of trust between law enforcement and, again, the communities that they serve, because these reforms do make our system fairer. And if law enforcement, and we've just, again, been so gratified to see so many members of law enforcement coming on board to support these reforms, if we can just work together and we can find this point of unity, pass this legislation at the federal level, I think we can start talking to each other again.
But the net effect of the Sessions efforts, the Attorney General's efforts, could be an increase in the federal prison population.
Yeah, there's no question. Of the roughly 2.3 million people currently incarcerated in this country, only about 200,000 of them are housed at the federal level, and the federal prison population has been decreasing. But obviously, if you're going to be charging people at higher levels, and a lot of these people are going to plead out, we're going to see people serving longer sentences, which, again, we know that doesn't make us safer. These individuals are going to get out. They're going to be less prepared to reenter society. And our hope is that we'll be able to convince the president that, especially your big red conservative states across this country have had a lot of success with criminal justice reform. And hope springs eternal that we could see similar progress at the federal level.
Holly Harris is the executive director of the U.S. Justice Action Network. She's on Twitter at U.S. Justice Action, more at justiceactionnetwork.org. Thanks for being with us here this morning.
Happy Memorial Day weekend.
Thank you.